Hey there, fellow philosophy enthusiast. Given your love for dissecting ideas, I think you'll really enjoy today's deep dive. It's right up your alley, trust me. We're going to be exploring this fascinating kind of philosophical tug of war going on within evolutionary biology.
It really gets into some foundational stuff. We're
Yes.
talking about how we even understand cause and explanation, but in the context of, the natural world, which is always a fun place to play.
Exactly. So, ready to grapple with some big questions?
Absolutely. Let's dive right in.
Okay, so the concept we're tackling today is adaptationism. And just to be clear, we're not simply talking about the fact that, living things adapt. It's kind of a given.
Right. It's much deeper than that. We're talking about a whole family of views within evolutionary biology that really puts natural selection front and center. It's the star of the show when it comes to explaining how evolution works, how we should study it, and even to some extent, what questions we should be asking in the first place.
So at its core, what are adaptationists really saying?
Well, they're saying that natural selection is the overwhelmingly dominant force shaping the evolution of traits. Some even go so far as to say it's the only truly significant force. And if you're an adaptationist, then figuring out just how natural selection has produced all the amazing adaptations we see in nature, that's the holy grail of evolutionary biology. It's like the ultimate puzzle to solve.
Okay, so that's the adaptationist perspective.
Yeah.
But you know how it is in philosophy? There's always another side to the story. You rarely find an argument that goes completely unchallenged. What's the counterpoint to adaptationism?
You got it. It wouldn't be a good philosophical debate without a good old clash of ideas, right? So the main alternative here is pluralism. And pluralists aren't saying natural selection is unimportant, not at all.
They're just saying it's not the only game in town.
Exactly. They're saying it's one important player, but it's part of a larger ensemble cast. Pluralists point to things like historical accidents, those quirky twists and turns that could have gone differently, as well as developmental pathways. Those constraints and possibilities inherent in how an organism grows and develops. And of course, genetic factors, too, which can really limit or shape what's even possible in terms of variation. All of these things, they argue, alongside natural selection, have a significant influence on how evolution plays out. And for a pluralist, understanding adaptation, while important, is just one piece of the puzzle among many when studying how life evolves. So in our deep dive today, we're going to be exploring this fundamental tension, this back and forth between adaptationism and pluralism.
Now, I can already hear our philosophy-minded listeners out there thinking, okay, cool debate, but why should I care?
Yeah.
Why is this biological back and forth relevant to someone interested in philosophy?
That is the key question, isn't it? And it's a great one. Because you see, this isn't just a scientific squabble over which evolutionary force is the strongest. This debate cuts to the core of some really fundamental philosophical issues. We're talking about causality, for one. In ridiculously complex systems like living organisms, are we really looking at one dominant cause that explains most things, or do we need to consider this whole web of interacting factors?
So it's about the nature of causality itself.
It really is. And then there's the whole question of explanation. What even constitutes a good scientific explanation, especially in a historical science like evolutionary biology, where, we can't exactly rerun the experiments of the past? Do we prioritize those elegant universal laws, or is it more about understanding those specific contingent pathways that led to what we see today?
I see where you're going with this. We're talking about big picture philosophical themes here.
Absolutely. We're talking about contingency versus necessity. How much of the living world is kind of inevitable because of this relentless pressure of natural selection, and how much is simply the result of, those historical accidents we talked about, plus the inherent constraints built into development? This debate forces us to think differently about the very foundations of how we approach scientific inquiry, especially when dealing with something as mind-bogglingly complex as evolution. Our aim today is to really break this debate down into digestible chunks, highlight the core arguments, but without getting too bogged down in jargon.
Okay, fantastic. So before we really get into it, can you tell our listeners a little bit about where we're getting this information from? What source material are we basing our deep dive on?
Great question. Our main guide today is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on adaptationism. It's considered a very rigorous, well-respected source in the field, and it really does a great job of laying out all the different arguments, the nuances within adaptationist thought, and even the historical context of this ongoing debate.
So we're on solid ground here.
We are. We've got a good foundation for our exploration.
Excellent. Now, I'm curious, this debate between adaptationism and pluralism, it's not exactly new, is it?
Not at all. It's been simmering for quite a while. People often point to the 1979 paper by Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin, the famous Spandrels of San Marco, as the starting point for this modern debate. But in reality, the roots go much deeper, all the way back to the 19th century.
Oh, wow. So really to the very beginnings of evolutionary thought.
Exactly. You can actually see early forms of both adaptationist and pluralist thinking in the writings of, well, Darwin himself, and also folks like Herbert Spencer and Alfred Russel Wallace, those pioneers of evolutionary theory.
So even then, there were hints of this tension between different ways of understanding the evolutionary process.
Absolutely. And then, as we move into the early 20th century, those views become even more distinct, more sharply defined. You've got two giants of evolutionary biology, Ronald Fisher and Sewell Wright, who really exemplify this early divergence.
Okay, tell me more about them.
Well, Fisher, he's kind of the poster child for early adaptationist thought. Natural selection was, for him, the primary driver of evolution. He saw organisms almost as perfectly optimized machines, shaped by this one powerful force. And in 1930, he publishes this hugely influential book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, which lays out a powerful mathematical framework for understanding how selection works. To this day, it's a cornerstone of adaptationist thinking.
And right, he offered a different perspective.
He did. Wright was more of a pluralist. He emphasized the importance of factors other than natural selection. Things like genetic drift, that random shuffling of genes in a population over time. It's like flipping a coin. Sometimes it lands heads, sometimes tails, and those chance events can really influence the course of evolution. Wright really stressed that aspect in his work. You see it in his 1931 paper, Evolution of Mendelian Populations, and even more so in his later work, The Multi-Volume Evolution and the Genetics of Populations.
So these two really set the stage for the modern debate.
They absolutely did. They highlighted that fundamental difference in emphasis selection as the dominant driver versus selection as one of several important players. And that tension continues to this day.
Fascinating. Now, you mentioned earlier that there was a kind of resurgence of interest in this debate in the mid-1970s. What happened then?
Well, a few things converged around that time. Evolutionary biology itself was experiencing a growth spurt. More researchers were getting into the field, especially focusing on ecology and evolution. And there was a growing interest in applying evolutionary principles to understand animal behavior, too. But scientifically, two things really stand out. First, you've got this surge in research in evolutionary ecology, which is all about explaining why certain traits seem to be locally optimal, like they're perfectly adapted to a specific environment. And a lot of this research was implicitly assuming that natural selection was the main force shaping those traits.
So they were kind of taking adaptationism as a given.
In many cases, yes. But then the second big development comes along, and this one really shakes things up. It's the rise of the neutral theory of molecular evolution, spearheaded by Motoo Kimura.
Tell me more about that.
Well, this theory basically proposed that a surprisingly large portion of the genetic variation we see, especially at the molecular level, doesn't actually have much, if any, impact on an organism's survival or reproduction. In other words, it's not really subject to natural selection. Instead, it's primarily driven by random genetic drift, those chance events we talked about with Wright. And this was, pretty controversial.
Okay.
It really reignited the debate about just how important selection really is compared to these non-selective processes. So that famous Spandrels paper by Gould and Lewontin in 1979, it needs to be understood within this broader historical context. It wasn't so much a starting point as it was a major contribution to this long-running discussion.
So there's this whole rich backdrop to the debate. Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry, it talks about different flavors of adaptationism. Can you unpack that for us? What are these different ways of thinking about adaptation?
Yeah, this is a really helpful way to understand all the nuances within adaptationist thought. Philosophers of biology, they've identified at least three distinct flavors: empirical adaptationism, explanatory adaptationism, and methodological adaptationism.
Okay, three flavors, and these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, right?
Not at all. And evolutionary biologists might hold on to elements of all three, but it's useful to see them as representing different kinds of commitments, different ways of approaching the role of adaptation.
Okay, let's start with empirical adaptationism then. What's the gist of that one?
At its core, empirical adaptationism is the view that natural selection is just incredibly powerful and pervasive in nature, and that there aren't that many significant constraints on what it can do. So someone who subscribes to this view would argue that for most, maybe even the vast majority of traits we see, their evolution can be primarily explained by focusing on the role of natural selection, and that those traits are likely to be what we call locally optimal,
Meaning?
meaning that they're kind of the best possible version of that trait given the immediate environmental pressures. So it's a claim about the actual real-world influence of natural selection compared to other evolutionary factors. Let's say you're studying, I don't know, the intricate camouflage of a moth. An empirical adaptationist might look at that and say, wow, this is clear evidence of selection at work, constantly fine-tuning the moth's appearance to perfectly match its surroundings.
Assuming that level of perfection is the norm.
Exactly. That's the key assumption. Now, of course, there are challenges to this view, particularly from evidence like the neutral theory of molecular evolution, which suggests that, hey, a lot of genetic changes aren't actually driven by selection at all. And there's also the recognition that development, the way an organism grows and evolutionary history, the baggage of the past, they can impose constraints on what's even possible.
So how does an empirical adaptationist typically respond when they encounter a trait that doesn't seem perfectly optimal, that doesn't quite fit that picture of perfect adaptation?
Well, their first instinct is usually to refine the model of selection they're using. They might say, well, you haven't considered all the relevant selective pressures yet, or maybe there are hidden benefits to the trait that we haven't discovered. They'd be less inclined to jump to the conclusion that selection isn't the primary driver.
Interesting. So they're really committed to that idea.
They are, and that contrasts with a pluralist perspective. A pluralist, faced with that same discrepancy, might be more likely to say, maybe this is actually evidence that selection is limited in its power, or that other factors are playing a significant role here.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's move on to flavor number 2. Explanatory adaptationism. What's the main focus there?
So explanatory adaptationism, it's less about the all-encompassing power of selection in every single case, and more about what we should consider the central goal of evolutionary biology. Proponents of this view, they argue that the most interesting and important things to explain in biology are those instances of apparent design. How is it that organisms often seem so remarkably well suited to their environments? They're adapted.
They fit.
They do. And for explanatory adaptationists, explaining that apparent design that fit through the mechanism of natural selection, that's the fundamental mission of evolutionary theory. It's like the key to unlocking the mysteries of life's complexity.
So it's not just about acknowledging that selection happens. It's about prioritizing a particular kind of explanation as the most significant, the most intellectually satisfying.
Exactly. And some people see this as a purely scientific claim about what phenomena are most worthy of our attention, while others, they see it as having a deeper, almost philosophical dimension. It's about the kind of understanding we should be striving for.
I can see that.
Think about figures like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett. They very much fall into this camp. They see explaining apparent design through natural selection as this powerful counter-argument to traditional arguments for intelligent design. But of course, not all evolutionary biologists share this emphasis. Someone who studies, say, systematics, the classification and relationships between organisms, they might see the main goal of evolutionary biology as accurately reconstructing the evolutionary tree of life, the history of how all living things are related, regardless of the specific forces that shape them along the way.
Interesting. It sounds like explanatory adaptationism can have implications beyond the immediate scientific research itself.
It definitely can. Because it places such a strong emphasis on natural selection as the key to understanding the living world, it often finds its way into those bigger, more philosophical discussions about, the role of biology in our overall worldview.
Okay, that's a good point. Now, we've got one more flavor to go. Methodological adaptationism. What's the strategic approach here?
This one takes a more pragmatic stance. It's less about grand claims about the power of selection and more about how we actually do evolutionary research. Methodological adaptationism says that even if natural selection ultimately turns out not to be the primary explanation for a particular trait, the most efficient way to start investigating it, the best place to begin, is by looking for an adaptive explanation.
So it's about having a clear starting point, a kind of default assumption.
Exactly. A methodological adaptationist might fully acknowledge that other factors could be important, but they believe that starting with adaptation as the working hypothesis is the most straightforward, most productive way to go. It's like a heuristic, a rule of thumb. And if, after a thorough investigation, you find a compelling adaptive explanation that's well supported by the evidence, then great, you've made progress. But if you don't, if you've really looked carefully and haven't found a good adaptive explanation, well, that in itself tells you something. It might point you toward those other factors, like developmental constraints or genetic drift.
Makes sense. So it's about research efficiency, having a starting point, and seeing where it leads you.
Exactly. But of course, this approach has its critics too. Some argue that by focusing so narrowly on adaptation right from the start, you might miss those other potentially more important factors, or that a more diverse set of initial approaches might actually be more fruitful in the long run. Gould and Lewontin, for example, they argued that you should always consider developmental and structural constraints alongside, or even before, selection pressures.
So it's about being careful not to let your initial assumptions blind you to other possibilities.
Right. It's important to be aware of potential biases, especially confirmation bias, that tendency we all have to seek out information that confirms what we already believe.
These distinctions between the different flavors of adaptationism, they're really insightful. It helps make sense of the debate. Now, one theme that keeps coming up is this issue of testing. How do we actually test these different ideas about the role of adaptation?
That is absolutely crucial. The question of rigorous testing and what kind of evidence is needed to support or refute a claim, it's central to the whole adaptationism debate. A lot of the critiques of adaptationism, especially those made in the past, they stem from this concern that some adaptationist claims just weren't held to a high enough evidentiary standard. It was too easy to come up with a plausible story about why a trait might be adaptive, but not enough effort was put into actually testing those stories.
So we need more rigor.
We do, and this has led many evolutionary biologists to advocate for what they call a more rigorous post-spandrels adaptationism. It emphasizes better testing methodologies using a wider range of data, including comparative studies across species, molecular genetic data, long-term observational studies, and a much more careful consideration of those developmental and evolutionary constraints we talked about.
Okay, so more data, more rigorous methods. But how do you actually go about testing, say, empirical adaptationism, that idea that selection is the dominant force producing optimal traits?
Well, two researchers, Orszak and Sober, have proposed a really interesting and systematic approach. They call it the Adaptationism Project.
Catchy title.
Right. Their idea is basically to critically evaluate a whole bunch of studies that explicitly test optimality models for specific traits. But not just any studies. They have to meet certain criteria. They have to quantitatively assess how well the predictions of the model match the actual data. And they also have to look at whether there's a lot of variation within a population and how well the model fits different individuals. The logic here is that if empirical adaptationism in its strongest form is generally true, then these optimality models, which are based on the assumption that selection is pushing traits toward optimal states, they should frequently provide good quantitative fits to the data across a wide variety of traits and organisms.
It's like a meta-analysis.
Exactly. It's trying to build this comprehensive body of evidence for or against the widespread power of optimizing selection.
Ambitious. And what have they found so far with this adaptationism project?
Well, interestingly, after reviewing a ton of scientific literature, they found that relatively few studies actually meet their criteria for rigorous testing, which kind of highlights the methodological challenges involved in definitively testing empirical adaptationism on a broad scale.
It's not easy.
It's not. And it raises the question of whether the studies we have are actually representative of the vast diversity of life out there and all the different ways evolution plays out. Now, as part of their project, they also outlined different hypotheses about the potential scope and power of natural selection. They used the letters U, I, O, and N to represent these hypotheses.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What do those letters stand for?
So, U stands for ubiquitous. Hypothesis U simply proposes that natural selection has played some role in the evolutionary history of a trait. It's a very minimal claim. Then you have I for important. Hypothesis I goes a bit further, saying that selection has been a significant factor in shaping the trait as we see it today. Then there's O for optimal. This is the strongest claim, hypothesis O, suggesting that natural selection has been the predominant, maybe even the sole force, and that the trait is currently at a local optimum, the best it can be given the current environment. And finally, there's N for neutral. Hypothesis N says that selection hasn't really played any role at all, and the trait's current form is mainly due to other stuff like random genetic drift.
So 4 hypotheses, ranging from a very minimal role for selection to selection being the primary driver.
Exactly. And Orszag and Sober argue that empirical adaptationism in its most robust form is essentially a generalization of hypothesis O. It's saying that for most traits, at least those not at the molecular level, natural selection is the sufficient explanation, and that those traits are generally found at or near their optimal states.
So how do you go about testing this strongest claim, hypothesis O, for a specific trait? What's the method?
Their protocol involves comparing the predictive power of what they call a censored evolutionary model with an uncensored model. The censored model only includes the effects of natural selection. It's like saying, let's see what happens if we assume selection is the only thing going on. Then you have the uncensored model, which allows for other factors like genetic drift or developmental constraints. And if the censored model, based solely on selection, gives you a good quantitative fit to the data, and adding those extra factors in the uncensored model doesn't really improve the fit much, or maybe even makes it worse, then that's seen as evidence in favor of the idea that selection is the main explanation, that it's enough to account for what we see.
So you're comparing the explanatory power of a simple model that only includes selection with a more complex model that allows for other stuff.
Precisely. And this is where optimality models come in, because they typically assume that selection is the main force driving populations toward those fitness peaks, toward those optimal states. But, this methodology isn't without its critics. Some people argue that using optimality models this way can be circular, because the models themselves often already assume that selection is dominant. Plus, there's always the issue of how to fairly compare a simple model with a more complex one. A more complex model might seem to fit the data better simply because it has more moving parts, more parameters to tweak, even if it's not actually a more accurate reflection of reality. That's the problem of overfitting.
I see. It's not a straightforward thing to test.
Not at all. And when we start talking about the evolution of molecules like DNA or proteins, things get even trickier. We have to consider that neutral hypothesis, the idea that a lot of molecular evolution might be random, and it becomes harder to even define what optimal means at that level. So, yeah, it's a complex area of research, and the debate continues.
It certainly does. Now, what about testing specific adaptive hypotheses for a particular trait? How does that work?
Well, one of the most important things to remember here is that you absolutely have to consider all the plausible alternative hypotheses. You can't just come up with a story about why a trait might be beneficial and call it a day. Gould and Lewontin, they were really adamant about this. We have to be wary of creating those just-so stories, those explanations that sound plausible but aren't actually supported by evidence. There might be multiple evolutionary pathways that could lead to the same outcome, some involving adaptation, some not. This is where philosophers of science talk about the problem of underdetermination of theory by evidence. The evidence we have might be consistent with several different explanations.
So rigorous testing means not just finding evidence for your adaptive hypothesis, but also trying to actively rule out those non-adaptive explanations.
Absolutely. If you're only looking for confirming evidence and not seriously considering those alternatives, especially those based on constraints or random drift, then your analysis is much weaker. It's important to remember that any adaptive hypothesis, it's built on a whole network of assumptions about development, ecology, genetics, evolutionary history. The strongest evidence comes from multiple independent lines of data that all point in the same direction and help you rule out those alternatives.
Okay, so multiple lines of evidence are key. You also mentioned earlier the importance of accounting for common ancestry when testing adaptive hypotheses. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. This gets into the whole idea of phylogeny, the evolutionary relationships between species. We know that all living things are related, right? So closely related species. They often share traits, not because those traits evolved independently due to similar environments, but because they inherited them from a common ancestor. This shared history, it can really complicate things when we're trying to test adaptive hypotheses.
I can see how that would be a problem.
It is. Because if you're comparing different species and you don't account for that shared ancestry, you might mistakenly conclude that a trait is an adaptation to a specific environment when it's actually just a result of inheritance. That's where comparative phylogenetic methods come in. These statistical techniques allow you to reconstruct evolutionary relationships and then statistically control for the effects of shared ancestry when you're looking for correlations between traits and the environment.
So it's a way of teasing apart the effects of shared history from the effects of adaptation.
Exactly. And these methods have become really important in evolutionary biology. Now, there's still debate about their limitations and the assumptions they make, but they've definitely strengthened our ability to test adaptive hypotheses more rigorously.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's shift gears a little bit now and talk about optimality models. They seem to play a big role in all of this, but there's also debate about how closely they're tied to adaptationism itself.
You're right, there is. While a lot of optimality models are designed to explore the potential outcomes of natural selection, some argue that using them doesn't necessarily mean you're committed to a strong adaptationist view. The question of whether natural selection generally leads to truly optimal traits, that's a whole debate in itself.
So some people see optimality models as just a tool, not necessarily an endorsement of adaptationism.
Right, it's like, okay, let's see what happens if we assume selection is optimizing this trait. What would the outcome be? And sometimes those models do a good job of predicting what we see in nature, but not always.
And what are some of the things that might prevent selection from actually producing optimal traits?
Yeah. Well, you've got genetic factors, for one. Things like genetic linkage, where genes close together on a chromosome tend to be inherited as a unit, and pleiotropy, where one gene can affect multiple traits. These can create these genetic correlations that make it hard to optimize one trait without affecting others. So, there are trade-offs. Then you have ecological factors. Environments are constantly changing, and there are often multiple conflicting selection pressures acting on a population. It's not always a simple story of selection favors this one best trait. And of course, we've talked about developmental constraints and the limitations on what forms are even possible.
So all of these things can complicate the picture.
They can. Now, adaptationists often counter by saying that over really long evolutionary timescales, new genetic variation can arise through mutation, and that can help overcome some of those constraints. So maybe in the short term, you don't see perfect optimality because of those limitations, but in the long term, selection has more room to work its magic. It's kind of like saying that given enough time and enough variation, selection can eventually reach those optimal states. But whether that actually happens, it depends on a lot of contingent factors, like when those beneficial mutations arise and how stable the environment is.
So it's not always a given that selection will have enough time and enough raw material to produce those optimal outcomes.
Exactly. And some researchers like Wilkins and Godfrey Smith have suggested that maybe the usefulness of adaptationism and optimality models, it depends on the scale of analysis. If you're looking at a very fine-grained short-term scale, maybe adaptationism works pretty well. But at a coarser, longer-term scale, those historical accidents and developmental constraints, they might become much more important in explaining why evolution took the path it did.
So the scale at which you're looking at things matters.
It does. But regardless of the scale, Orszag and Sober, they really emphasize that for optimality models to provide strong support for adaptation, you need two things. First, the model's predictions have to quantitatively match the data really well. And second, you have to look at how much individual variation within a population actually fits the model. If a lot of individuals deviate from that optimal state, it might suggest that other factors are at play.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's circle back to constraints, which we've been talking about a lot. Are constraint-based explanations simply acknowledging limitations on what selection can do, or are they fundamentally different kinds of explanations? Are they rivals to adaptive explanations?
Yeah, this gets into a really interesting philosophical question about the nature of explanation in evolution. Gould and Lewontin, they famously argued that constraints, whether they're developmental, structural, or historical, should be considered as actively competing with adaptive hypotheses. They said that a lot of features of organisms might not be adaptations at all, but rather byproducts of those constraints. Just like the spandrels in architecture. They're there because of the way the arches are built, not because they serve some specific function.
So constraints is an alternative way of explaining why things are the way they are.
Exactly. On the other hand, people who are really into optimality modeling, they often view constraints as more like background conditions. Selection is still the primary creative force, and constraints just set the boundaries of what's possible for selection to achieve.
So two different perspectives. And I imagine there are concerns about downplaying the role of constraints.
There definitely are. Critics of that constraints as background conditions view, they worry that it can lead to an underestimation of how important constraints are in shaping the course of evolution. It's not just about limiting what selection can do, they might actually actively channel evolution down certain paths, making some outcomes more likely than others.
Okay, so what kinds of constraints are we talking about here?
Well, developmental constraints are a big one. These are basically biases in the way organisms develop, which can limit the range of variation that's even available for selection to act on. It's helpful to distinguish between constraints on adaptation, where selection might want to go in a certain direction but is blocked by some limitation, and constraints on form, where the developmental system itself just can't produce certain variations no matter how advantageous they might be.
So constraints can act at different levels.
They do. Interestingly, some adaptationists argue that building and testing optimality models can actually help us identify those constraints. Because if the model predicts an optimal trait that we don't actually see in nature, it might suggest that there's a constraint preventing it from evolving.
So the mismatch between model and reality can be informative.
It can. And then you have the field of evolutionary developmental biology, or EVO-DEVO, which uses different methods, more experimental and comparative, to uncover those developmental constraints. They're often less focused on optimality and more interested in understanding the fundamental rules of development and how those rules have shaped the evolution of body plans.
It sounds like there might be room for both approaches.
I think there is. Optimality modeling can tell us what selection would favor if there were no constraints, while EVO-DEVO helps us understand what's actually possible given the rules of development.
Okay, that's a good way to think about it. Now, from a philosophical perspective, how do these different views of constraints as background conditions versus active causes impact our understanding of how causation and explanation work in evolution?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the philosophical debate. If we say that a scientific explanation has to identify the causes of a phenomenon, then the question becomes, do constraints count as causes? Are they simply passive limitations, or do they actively influence the direction of evolution?
So it's a question of whether constraints have causal power.
Exactly. And there are different philosophical accounts of causation. Some might say that constraints are just background conditions because they don't involve the transfer of energy, which some see as essential for causation. But other accounts, those that focus on counterfactuals like what would have happened if this constraint were different, they might argue that constraints do have causal influence. Because if the constraint were different, the outcome might have been different too. And even those biases in the generation of variation due to development, they can be seen as probabilistic causes, making some evolutionary changes more likely than others.
So it's a subtle but important distinction.
It is, and this broader philosophical debate about whether boundaries or limitations can be considered causes, that's relevant here too. Ultimately, it highlights the importance of being really clear about what our hypotheses are. Are we primarily emphasizing selection, constraints, or other factors like drift or history? And even though most adaptationists would agree that some constraints exist, pluralists often argue that in many cases those constraints are so significant that selection might not even be the primary explanation. And research in EVO-DEVO, it's really helping us explore those potential evolutionary trajectories and understand the nature of those constraints.
This has been a fantastic deep dive, really insightful. Let's wrap things up now by summarizing some key takeaways, especially for our listeners who are into philosophy.
Okay, so for the philosophically minded, this debate between adaptationism and pluralism, it's a great example of a core tension in science. It's that tension between, on the one hand, wanting those simple, elegant explanations like natural selection explains it all, and on the other hand, having to acknowledge the messy, contingent nature of history, where multiple causes are usually at play.
So it's a clash between simplicity and complexity.
It is, and it forces us to think hard about what a good scientific explanation even is, especially in historical science like evolution, where we can't rewind the tape. It raises questions about the roles of contingency and necessity in shaping the living world, and it really highlights the challenges of testing evolutionary hypotheses rigorously. It's not easy to disentangle all those different factors that have been at work over millions of years.
It's a reminder of the inherent complexity of evolution. And for those who are looking for that aha moment, what would you say is the main takeaway?
Well, hopefully you've come away with a more nuanced understanding of what adaptationism really means. It's not just one monolithic thing, it's a spectrum of views with different emphases and research priorities. And you've also seen how much effort is being put into developing more rigorous methods for testing those adaptationist claims. It's an ongoing process, and there are still challenges, but it's an exciting time to be studying evolution.
Absolutely. So how might the insights from